Hello everyone, and welcome to our Family History More Than a Story webinar this evening. It's very nice to have you here. This is our first webinar for the series, and we're very excited to welcome Dr Kate Bagnall and Dr Sophie Couchman. So firstly, I would like to acknowledge the country on which we meet. I myself come to you from Darug and Gundungurra country in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, and I pay my respects to the elders of that country and to Aboriginal people present today. Now, the University of Tasmania is based on the Sandy Bay campus, and we're meeting on Hobart time. So I would like to acknowledge that we meet on Lutruwita, Tasmania, Aboriginal land, sea and waterways, and acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Muwinina people. The Muwinina people belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world, and they cared and protected country for thousands of years. They knew this land, they lived on the land, and they died on these lands, and I honour them. For the Muwinina people, the area around Nipaluna or Hobart was their country, and they called Mount Wellington Kunanyi. I acknowledge that it is a privilege to stand on country and walk in the footsteps of those before us, beneath the mountain among the gums and the waterways that continue to run through the veins of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status, and to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community that continues to care for country. I recognise a history of truth which acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonisation upon Aboriginal people, resulting in the forcible removal from their lands. And I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. So thank you, and I hope that you pay your respects wherever you come to us from. So for housekeeping, it's important to know this session will be recorded, and that means it'll be available as soon as we can get it up. And you should get an email telling you that it is live. And we have a couple of little features with Zoom. We would like you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen rather than putting your questions in the chat window. Use chat for chat, and we'll look forward to, it's always great in these webinars to watch the number of comments that fly up the sides, but it's a very engaging audience. So welcome. Firstly, I would like to introduce Dr. Sophie Couchman, who is a professional historian and curator who works closely with communities to tell their stories. She has researched and published in the field of Chinese Australian history and has been involved in a range of historical activities, including developing exhibitions, walking tours, oral histories, and online resources. And talking with Sophie today is her long-term collaborator, Dr Kate Bagnall, who's familiar to many of you as the Senior Lecturer in Humanities and Coordinator of the Family History Program at the University of Tasmania. Kate has worked extensively with family and community historians in her research on the history of Chinese migration and settlement in colonial Australia and New Zealand. So welcome both of you, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you, and a beautiful acknowledgement of country.
Oh yeah, I think it's I think it's quite special. I always feel very moved when I read it, and yes, it's really important. And you know, so I grew up in Tasmania, and we I never heard any of those words, that language. So for me, it's very powerful. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
well, I'm coming in from Yalukit Willem country, which is Bunwurrung.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. And Kate, of course, is in Sandy Bay.
Sandy Bay.
Yeah. So I guess I will start the session by asking you to introduce yourselves and explain your interest in Chinese Australian history. So Sophie, would you like to start?
Sure. So my interest in Chinese Australian history started way back in the early 1990s as a recent geography graduate, surprisingly, a science student, but it's continued on and off from that period, and involved doing a master's looking at Melbourne's Chinatown, and then spending 2 big chunks of time in China. First, at the start of my PhD, doing some research in 2002, and then on a Victorian government Hamer scholarship, which was a language scholarship in Nanjing in 2013. And over that time, I dabbled in southern China, but I must admit there was a lot of traveling all over China that I did at that over in those two trips. But my experiences in southern China were quite, I don't know, profound as someone who researches Chinese Australian history, and so that kind of led on to the tours that we're going to talk about.
Excellent. It's yeah, I mean, just the thought of being able to travel, it's quite
I know, it's a bit novel, isn't it?
It's a weird nostalgia that we have. Yeah. So Kate.
So my interest in Chinese Australian history came about by being in China and being in these ancestral homelands of the early Chinese migrants to Australia. So I first, I'm very lucky that my family loved to travel, and so I actually first went to China as a young teenager, and I had family who were living in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has been part of my life and my family's travels for a long time. But when I finished my honours degree in history, I took a position as an English teacher in a city called Zhuhai, which is just across the border from Macau and about an hour's ferry ride from Hong Kong. And that year that I spent teaching English, I also became aware of the connections of the Pearl River Delta region where I was living with Australia. And I started reading the history. I used to kind of go on trips to Hong Kong when I could and scour English language bookshops for history books. And I became increasingly aware of the connections between Australia and this particular part of southern China. For instance, I had a good friend who I met who knew that her grandfather and great-grandfather had been in Australia, but both of them had died in Australia, but they didn't know where they had lived or what they had done. So these kinds of stories got me really interested. And then I came back to Australia and started a PhD and decided that I wanted to follow up on these historical connections, particularly through the lens of women and families. And through my PhD research, I went back. I also spent 6 months studying at Zhongshan University in Guangzhou, studying Mandarin and Cantonese on a Chinese government scholarship. And so really from those my first trip to China as an adult in 1996, Guangdong and Hong Kong and Macau have been a really integral part of my life, both my personal life and my academic life. And it was that kind of being in that place and understanding the historical connections that has really inspired me in a lot of the research that I've done, looking at particularly at mixed race Australian Chinese families who've spent time in China and back and forth between the two countries.
Yeah, it's no, I find the whole sense of going and, you know, learning about Chinese history in China, like, is quite intricate. So I want to sort of build on that theme of intrepidness, but because before the pandemic, you know, all those years ago, you both ran heritage tours to Hong Kong and Guangdong. So how did you come to do that? What was the source of that idea?
Before we answer that question, I'm going to start a slideshow, Naomi, because I think,
yes.
You know, I think seeing the place and understanding some of the landscape and the geography and the food is really critical to what we're doing. So let me start.
And I'll just kind of add on. I mean, one of the things that I quite like about Kate and my collaboration is the different kind of experiences that we bring, although there's overlapping in what we do. But my kind of entrance into Chinese Australian history really comes very much as a white Australian who had exposure to Asia. And so my interest in Chinatown was Melbourne's Chinatown, which is where I was born and where I grew up. And it always felt like it was always a place that I had visited and that had been a part of my life, visiting David Wong's Emporium. And throughout my career, I've always encountered, and Kate will have too, this question about, well, why are you interested in Chinese Australian history? And for me, I've always been interested in Australian history. And so I'm interested in Australian history, but I'm interested in the Chinese aspect of that Australian history. And while I don't have Chinese ancestry, I think that understanding Australia's Chinese history is part of understanding being Australian.
I would agree. Yes. I mean, that's, Chinese people have always been in Australia, and so it is a very big part of that.
Kate,
did you want to talk about your?
Yeah, can you see the slides now? Yes. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I really profoundly affected me from being in Guangdong was the perspective that one got on the history. I was very lucky that in the year that I spent living in Zhuhai, I made really good friends with many of my students. So I taught at a kind of an adult education college at a night school. And so many of the friends that I made were local Zhuhai people or local Guangdong people. And they kind of introduced me to a world that I think many foreigners weren't able to access in China in the mid-90s. They invited me to their homes, to their weddings. One of my good friends that I made had a baby that year. So I got to kind of experience some of the cultural and historical, the experiences that many people weren't able to experience. And then when I have gone back over the years, particularly to do field work in the rural villages in Guangdong, the ancestral villages where many of the early Chinese migrants to Australia came from. It really gave me a very different sense of perspective on the history. And having worked, so my PhD research was on mixed race Chinese Australian families in colonial New South Wales in particular. And many of the descendants that I met and I talked to, because they were the product of mixed marriages, they really didn't know very much about the Chinese part of their ancestry. And because of the particular, political differences between Australia and China, particularly in the middle of the 20th century when many of them were young, China was, a very foreign place in many ways. Lots of them didn't speak English or have any kind of Chinese cultural background. And so the thought of going to China to trying to find their own Chinese roots was something that seemed insurmountable. And I knew that there were heritage tours run out of the United States of a similar nature, sort of route searching tours. And from probably about 2002, I had this idea that it would be really fantastic to be able to bring some of the Chinese Australian family historians that I was working with to take them back to Guangdong and to show them the places and to show them the culture and history that I was able to experience through those connections that I'd made when I was living there.
And when Kate asked me to be a part of it, I went, yes. But I suppose I also, as I kind of sort of alluded to, a lot of my experience had been traveling around northern China and other parts of China. And so I was very struck by how different southern China was compared to other parts of China. It's only been really quite recently that southern China has opened up. At the time that I first visited there, I think there was one page in the Lonely Planet China Guide, pretty much about Guangdong, and it was just the city. It was nothing. I just got on a bus and just said, take me to the end of the line, and they thought I was crazy. And so I knew it was difficult for people to get there because it's not on the tourist kind of route. But also that the culture was different there, that it looked different. And as somebody who had sort of started her Chinese Australian history journey, I realized that it turned my thinking totally upside down, in terms of thinking about things from China, from the village, from those different perspectives. And a big example for me is the museums there. So if you go to museums in Australia that talk about Chinese Australian history, they tend to talk all about Chinese Australians, what they did in Australia, and they came from the Pearl River Delta. Maybe they came from the Siyap or from Zhongshan in that area, but it's very vague as to where they came from. When you go to overseas Chinese museums in China, it's the other way around. You hear all about what overseas Chinese contributed to China and to the local area. You hear all about the specifics of the villages, of the regions, but they come from overseas. And so the overseas component, Australia's story will be mixed in with Cuba's story, with San Francisco's story, with Canada's story. So it's very, it helps you to kind of just see things in a different way.
I've had a similar experience going to Vietnam and learning that the what we called the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese called the American War. So yeah, it's and a similar experience in museums, and it really underscores the importance of place, doesn't it? But but I guess as well, place is one of those places where you frame imagination and frame thinking about things, and so going to the actual villages is really, really important. So I mean, maybe later we can talk a little bit about village structure and how important that kind of is in terms of understanding Chinese culture. But what sort of people did you have taking the tours, and you know, what were their sort of, where did you go, and what sorts of activities did you do when you were on the tours? How did you work out how to give people this really rich experience?
Well, it was a mix, wasn't it, Kate? We had an expectation that it would be family historians, and probably family historians who hadn't been to China before, who probably didn't have any Chinese language. And in fact, we were right in some respects, but we were wrong in other respects. I think I also expected that the people who would come would be people who were part of our research and professional networks. We were also a bit wrong in that too. So we had people who joined who had just heard about the tours, who we didn't know. We had PhD students and scholars and writers attend. And we also had people who had been to southern China, in fact, before and visited their home villages, but they were interested in getting a Chinese Australian historical perspective on that story. Have I missed anyone, Kate?
I think that's right. I mean, Sophie and I are both involved in Chinese Australian community history organisations. Particularly Sophie's involved with one in Melbourne. And so I think there was probably a core group in each of the tours that knew Sophie and me through those activities. But as she said, you know, we were surprised, and I think particularly surprised that people who had a much more immediate connection to Guangdong would find value in what we were doing. So some of the people who came on the tour, as Sophie said, knew where their own ancestral villages were, whereas most of the people didn't. And so one of the really fantastic things that we were able to do on the tours was to tailor the itinerary on each of the tours that we ran to include visits to some of those known villages. So some of the places that we visited, I had done field work in, and so I had a connection to those villages through that work. But we also organised to visit villages of people who were on the tour. And what that really provided, I think, was for those people who weren't able to their own family story to China, because of the disconnect between, their first Chinese, their Chinese ancestor arriving in the middle of the 19th century, and them in 21st century Australia, that we all got to experience that thrill, that joy, that excitement of visiting the villages of people, for whom they were so significant and special in their own family stories. So I think actually the combination of people on each of the tours worked really beautifully. And one of the things that we encouraged was for us all to learn from each other. Family historians have such a wealth of detailed information and experience about their own families. And Sophie and I, as academic historians, come at it from a different perspective. So being able to spend time together, so the tours ran for about a little bit over a week each, and spending that time together facilitated lots of conversations where we learnt from family historians, and they learnt from us, and they learnt from each other as well.
Yeah, it was, we tried to set up a very level structure so that while we were providing information, we're there to kind of chat, that we were also drawing out other people's stories, and having kind of other scholars and PhDs on the tour helped to kind of facilitate that. And where we could, we got people to stand up and share their story in particular places.
Yeah. So we developed the itinerary around some key themes. We really wanted to try and trace in the tour the sort of the reverse of the journey that someone might have taken from China to Australia in the 19th or early 20th century. So we started in Hong Kong, which was a central node in overseas Chinese migration from Guangdong from the middle of the 19th century. So we started there. Hong Kong also became home to a significant Chinese Australian community, particularly in the early 20th century. So Sophie put together a really lovely walking tour of the Hong Kong cemetery. Do you want to talk about that, Sophie?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the really nice things about running, we ran the tours 3 times over 3 years, was that each time we would kind of develop and it would evolve. And so the first time we went, I explored the Hong Kong cemetery for the first time and discovered that there was a database of the people who'd been buried there. And I thought, well, I wonder how many Australians there are. And so I then went away and thought, well, I can develop a walking tour and guide people through this space. And there was also a beautiful mansion that was associated with Frank Shamgun, who was a Chinese herbalist in Ballarat. And so I gathered a bunch of photographs. I have a friend in Hong Kong, and I got her to, it's a very hilly cemetery, so it's not possible to use Google Maps as nicely as you might imagine. And I then ran this tour through the cemetery where we visited the different graves and heard the different stories about people who were buried there. And that was great the first time we did it, and then there was a lot of rain the second time that we did it. We got very, very wet. That's kind of where all the learning was happening with us, as well as with people coming on the tours. Yeah. The other kind of walking tour that we developed as we went through is that when we had days kind of like an afternoon off, Kate and I would go exploring. We're in the city that we were staying in, and because we're used to being in China, we're very comfortable in the space. We'd be poking around different, laneways. Oh, here they are on the screen, and corridors, and just observing different things about the city. And we realised that some of the people on the tour were not as adventurous as we were. They felt a bit more nervous about it. And so we thought, well, if we develop a a walking tour, a self-guided walking tour, people can use that as a way of exploring the city and exploring both the modern and the old city, and kind of think about how to look at the city, you know, to look at the city more closely, not just at the shopping.
Although shopping's
a very important part.
Shopping's important, and I'm starting to get very hungry. I'm thinking I'm having Chinese for dinner. But I'm noticing, like, how, yes, the sort of feeling the place, but that much of it seems to be very 19th century. Many of the places that you went to, so these are very much the places that ancestors came from, that's what they left, and what some of them returned to when they returned from Australia. So it's very fascinating and very intrepid. Like, how did you work all of that out from I mean, I'm in awe, like, having done a fair bit of guiding and museum work, just being responsible for that number of people, but also coming up with an informative walking tour for them seems to be like, I'm really, really impressed.
I think the itinerary came out of places that, mostly came out of places that I knew and had been to and had spent time in. So both Sophie and I have collaborated with a really wonderful architectural historian and heritage conservator, Dr. Celia Jinhua Tan, who's at Wuyi University. And Celia runs an amazing, amazing heritage project in a village called Candong Village in Kaiping, which is one of the counties in the Pearl River Delta. So we were very, very lucky that Celia was willing to spend time with us. And we spent, on the first tour, we only spent one day with her in Candong, and then everybody loved it so much that we structured more time around.
It got bigger and bigger, didn't it, as time went on?
It did. Celia's an amazing public historian, and really, so she's grown up in that area. She has a PhD from Hong Kong University, and the work that she does in Candong is just amazing. It's won UNESCO Heritage Awards because of the work that she does there. So basically, she has been working on, in partnership with the people in the village, on restoring both the built heritage and the intangible cultural heritage of the village. So you might have seen before that there were slides of people making food and Chinese opera. So Celia offers a heritage kind of it's a heritage education centre. Mostly they cater to school students, but she very generously also included us in the work that they do. And we, in the village, we were taught how to cook things. Celia explained so much about the way that villages work, the layout of them, the geography, the architecture, and the way that the landscape and sort of cultural practices are really entwined. And so each of the tours after Hong Kong, we went to Celia's village, to Candong, the Candong Heritage Education Centre. And through that experience with Celia and her incredibly in-depth knowledge of language, culture, food, architecture, just everything, I think it really set up everybody with a really strong understanding of what they should be or could be looking for in the places that we then went. Whether that's understanding how the buildings were constructed, or why there's a kind of white powder on many of the bricks. It's because of the chemicals that are leaching from the bricks, because of the materials that they're made from. Or understanding why the houses in villages are laid out in the way that they are. So all these things that Celia could tell us in that day or couple of days that we were with her really set everybody up. And every time I talk to Celia, I learn more things. So we're really very lucky to have her involved in the tours.
The other thing that we did was we had a part of running the tours in China. We needed to partner with a a Chinese travel agency. So we had a travel agency in Canberra who dealt with the Australian booking of tickets. And then they partnered with a Chinese tour company. And we were very fortunate. You can see Stony there in an orange T-shirt, who is
Green.
Green, sorry. Green. Gosh, that's very colourblind, isn't it? A fantastic local tour guide. So he provided translation, but kind of much more than that, because we all got to know Stony as we went along. He was very personable. So he would be able to, if people wanted to talk to villagers, he was able to do translation for us. He was able to help navigate and find some of the villages when they were challenging to find. He negotiated with the driver. And he was there to, if someone saw some graffiti on the street, what does that mean? What does that say? He was there to talk about, what that was.
Yep. And also, very importantly, he was excellent at ordering food.
Oh, he was.
Food was a really big part of the tours. I miss that food so much. But because we were kind of targeting kind of local heritage practices and local cultural traditions. So a lot of the restaurants that we ate at were very kind of local restaurants, either with in the countryside.
Like this one we're looking at right now.
That's kind of the other end of the scale. But, Stony we would turn up at the restaurant and he would just talk to the head waiter or the chef and, select a range of dishes. I don't think we ate the same dish, 2 days in a row, which I'm a vegetarian, and that's particularly important skill because otherwise you end up eating the same dish each time. But, we were very, very lucky. One of the things that Stony had was local language as well. So Guangdong is a Cantonese speaking part of China, but within that, there are other languages as well spoken in Guangdong. So some of the areas that we were traveling through, sort of standard Cantonese is much more what they speak, but there were also dialects, Cantonese dialects, particularly in places like Taishan and Kaiping. And in those villages, particularly speaking to older people, interacting with older people, they don't necessarily speak Mandarin or Mandarin very well. And sometimes even their Cantonese is a bit rusty. So having Stony there, able to, he was so personable and able to kind of forge across those language barriers, as well as the kind of cultural insights that he brought as well.
And I think the blending of the historical and the modern was really important for us. We wanted and showing the diversity of cultures across modern China. So both the good and the bad. But we tried to show very grand architecture, but also very humble architecture. We looked at villages that were very rural with pigsties, versus villages that had been kind of subsumed into bigger cities. We wanted people to explore different kinds of food. We wanted people to see different kinds of modern China, people watching satellite TV in a small village versus living very, very modern lives in big cities. And this was sort of part of just getting a more nuanced view of what China is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to sort of talk about, what I found when I've traveled in Asia, which has been pretty limited, but it's quite different, but just that sense of the importance of village structure and village kind of culture. Do you want to kind of tell us what you've learned through doing these tours about the role of that in Chinese life?
Sure. So the way that you do Chinese family history is very different from the way that you do Australian or UK family history. I mean, it's really centered around your family, your clan, your lineage. And that's why we've been talking about going back to people's ancestral villages, because there was no, in the 19th century, early 20th century, there was no kind of central registration of births, deaths and marriages in the way that there was in Australia or the UK. So there is no central place where you can go and look up your ancestor's name and find kind of the vital records about them. And that's why kind of connecting to an ancestral village is so critical. But it's always a patrilineal family tree that you're looking for. So when we talk about an ancestral village, that means your father's 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 village. Which is, you know, I'm a feminist historian who's very interested in women's stories and experiences. So that's, you know, one of the stumbling blocks with doing kind of field work on the ground, that women disappear very quickly from the family records. So within a clan or a family and a lineage, there will be family trees called japu. And those record that patrilineal line. So, you know, I guess for many people, the Holy Grail might be finding, you know, their ancestral village and then a family tree that has their ancestor's name in it. For lots of family historians in Australia, that's never going to be a reality because of the gap in the records that we have in Australia. Don't enable many people to kind of make that concrete connection. But in other ways, you know, you can be lucky, particularly of those for those people descended from the really early sort of 19th century migrants.
We have a related question, which is from Mandy. Hi, Mandy, who asks if anyone tracked down Chinese family while they were on the tour.
No, the work was done beforehand,
right,
to be relatively sure. It's I think one of the things that you learn when you try and do work in China is it's much harder than you think it's going to that you think it's going to be. So on one of the tours, I was looking for a particular village. I had the Chinese characters. I knew which district it was in. I knew the family that I was looking for and the characters and name of that person. And we went to 3 different villages of that name and didn't find the right village. So that's the kind of challenge that you're looking at. And I felt really guilty because I dragged this tour over all over the countryside and we got nowhere with it. But some of the people who are on the tour said, oh, that was one of the best bits because, you know, we got to see research in action and how, you know, sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah. But Sophie, I mean, some of the tour guests, particularly people from CAFOV, were able to make connections when they were in China that they then have followed up on.
Absolutely. So they kind of identified the village and then they went and visited the village for the first time. And so this is identifying the village from paper records and then reconnecting with family in that village that then has led on to lasting, you know, like total reconnection. So I'm thinking of Don and Ming who reconnected with their village. They are still using WeChat and a lot of Google Translate to communicate with family members there. They've since discovered that there was family in Melbourne that they didn't even know about that they've reconnected with. They found the family Dapu and they've paid to get that translated. And they've also, they found the family home and have had the objects and the house itself photographically documented. So it's been a very rich journey for them. and others have done similar things. And someone else has discovered Cuban connections in their family through going back and visiting the village and reconnecting with family there. The other thing I wanted to say about these villages too is that it's surprising. Because the young people have tended to move away, but the older people have stayed, is that it is possible to have memory of previous ancestors. So you can go back to the family village and there might be somebody who remembers that your family was part of the village. Or they will remember that there were Chinese from that village who went to Australia or who went to Canada. And that's quite incredible. Really powerful. And the emotion of going back to a village where your ancestors have come from is really very, very moving. And we always people had the choice whether they wanted the whole tour group with them or whether they wanted to do it on their own, and people chose in different ways. But we were all on the journey with them, the nervousness beforehand. Here we've got this beautiful photo of Richard, who's he doesn't know, the family doesn't know exactly where his ancestors came from, but Kate's worked with them, and we believe it was one of the villages in this area, and so that was him showing respect to his ancestors while he was there. I've lost my train of thought now, but just this sense of being able to find. When we were there with Richard, we spoke to people who said they couldn't remember his family, but they knew that there were Chinese who'd gone to Australia.
Wow. I just remind people that there is definitely time for questions. So if you have questions, put them into the chat and into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and I will ask them for you. But so that word for the family tree, is it Zhangda?
So there's Jiapu. So
Jiapu.
So this is in Mandarin. So
yeah.
Jiapu, Jiapu.
Yeah.
Or the other one is a Zupu, Zupu. So one is a family tree and one is a sort of a lineage tree or a clan tree. So,
and what are they? How are they recorded? Are they written down? Are they scrolls? Like, can you tell me what one looks like?
The ones that you mostly see are books.
Mm-hmm.
So they will often. So there can be multiple versions of a family tree, and mostly you will hold the kind of the one that's your direct line. So so this, I'll just kind of diverge for a minute. This slide that you can see now is of a village called Sichuli, where it's actually a village where I've done lots of field work, and I was trying to identify find out details about a particular person I was researching, and I worked out that it was this particular village, but he didn't appear in any of the family trees that they had, because he would have been the end of his line. So he didn't have any descendants who would have kept a copy of his direct lineage. So I could find family trees that had men of the same generation as his father. And I knew that because of traditional naming patterns. Cantonese families often have a generation name, which is drawn from a poem. So each baby boy or man of a same generation would have the same character, the same generation name. So I was able to identify that it was the right place through that record. But it's really, there are libraries. I know that the Family Search have a huge library of lineages. and many of them are digitized. But the real trick is finding the one that relates to your own direct family. Often the Jiapu kind of detail the history of your lineage back, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Many of these villages were settled by Chinese who migrated from further north. So often, in other, quite a long way north in other provinces. So they will often start with the first ancestor who settled in this particular part of China in Guangdong, and then kind of trace the lineages down. But once again, it's father to son to father to son, and women are very, very rarely recorded in those records.
So that means any Australian, sorry, just quickly, Sophie, any Australian women that went back would be very quickly lost in those records.
They wouldn't be recorded. Yeah.
Sophie, you were about to say.
I was just going to prompt Kate to talk about the Howard's the kind of the reconnection that can occur, because the way that land ownership in southern China is complicated, and so often buildings remain owned by families that are no longer present, and nothing can be done with them until permission from the family is obtained. So one of the exciting parts of our first tour.
So one of our lovely tour guests on our first tour, Howard, who I think is probably with us tonight, Howard had done lots and lots of research into his wife's family, who are a very prominent Chinese Australian family, the Choi, and particularly the Choi Hing family, who were the founders of one of the 4 big Chinese Australian department stores in Shanghai. So Howard, I think if I'm remembering this correctly, he and his wife had been to the village before, but because of the tour, we went back to Howard's village, and in the process of kind of organising that, the village officials became very interested and aware that we were coming, and that Howard was going to be there, and so they were working on a heritage project in the area, and they wanted to do restoration work on buildings that were funded by this particular family. So there was an ancestral hall, a very impressive school. So a lot of overseas Chinese sent money back to support education, the building of schools. And also there was an ancestral home, a really beautiful home as well. And so although those 3 buildings are kind of falling into disrepair, and so the local government office wanted to restore them, but they weren't able to do so because they were not in contact with the legal owners of the properties, who were the descendants who were overseas. So through Howard, Howard put them in contact with kind of the relevant parts of the family. So this is Howard in the red t-shirt there, talking to the officials. And so by the time we went back on the 3rd trip, those buildings had been restored, and we were able to visit again and see them in a much different condition from the first time we'd been there.
That's absolutely amazing. Just this photo here on the screen, which is incredible, is the old fishing boats and a flyby and skyscrapers, and then this bizarre circular thing. Can you tell us what that photo is?
I certainly can. So that is Zhuhai. That's my other home. Zhuhai is, as I said, just across the border from Macau. I can go back to that picture. Look, there you go. And pause it. So Zhuhai is on the Pearl River, on the Pearl River Delta, and that building shaped like this is the new Opera House building, and it's meant to, from a different angle, it's meant to look like an oyster shell, like the 2 halves of a shell coming together. Mm-hmm. But Zhuhai is one of those cities that has seen incredible change and development over the past 20 years. So I lived there in 1997, and it's entirely unrecognisable from the city that it was 25 years ago. And part of that has come from both Hong Kong and Macau returning to PRC control. because when I lived there in the late 90s, most people from Zhuhai had never been across the border to Macau, let alone to Hong Kong. And now there's, hundreds of thousands of people who cross that, or maybe not now because of COVID, but in pre-COVID times, there'd be hundreds of thousands of people crossing that border every day. So Zhuhai has really changed as a city. And I like to joke that we arranged that flyby for the day that we were there, but it was just a lucky coincidence.
Yes, Kate was giving us a local fishing tour when that happened.
Yeah.
It's an incredible photo. It's that sort of juxtaposition. And it kind of makes me wonder how many villages have disappeared in the process of all of that modernisation and essentially have literally been, buried by all of that.
Yeah, so one of the villages that we visited was in a city called Jiangmen, and it really is a village in a city. So the city has grown up and around it, but the village itself remains a village. It's with low-rise buildings, the ancestral hall temple in the middle, but sort of skyscrapers all around it, and that's a really typical kind of aspect of development in Guangdong over the last 20 years probably.
Wow.
Yeah.
And we tried to, there was sort of, so Samyup is one of the kind of regions where many Chinese in Australia came from, but it's very close to Guangzhou, and so it has become, those villages have largely been lost. So we also had to kind of choose where we went on the tour.
Yeah, of course. I was really struck when you were telling story about Howard's intervention that you've had a tangible effect. Your tours have had a tangible effect on the heritage that's available to be seen. So it's really it's amazing. What an incredible experience for you and for everyone who's been on the tour. And I can see the chat, people saying that they're dying to do it, but also people reminiscing about the ones that they've done, and everyone agrees that we are very hungry now. So we just have a question from Steve asking to what extent were there arranged marriages, where the marriage was arranged in China and the wife was sent to Australia, and were such arrangements documented, or are they only known through family testimony?
So that was arranged marriages were very, very common, and in fact the norm in Guangdong well into the 20th century. I have good friends whose parents, good friends my age, whose parents marriages were arranged in the 1960s and early 1970s. So it was a custom that, really continued even post 1949 and when the Communist Party brought in sort of cultural changes around marriage and the family. So definitely arranged marriages were very common, as were kind of multiple marriages and concubines. So it was really not uncommon for a male migrant to Australia to be married as a young man in his village to a village wife, come to Australia, make money, send money home, and then also maybe go home, and maybe there would have been a long period of time before he was actually able to go home again. And so many families were first of all separated for long periods of time, and children obviously couldn't be born during that time, and producing a male heir was really, really very central to Cantonese culture. So sons could be adopted, but also a man might go back and then take a younger wife who was able to provide him with a male heir. Overseas migration from Guangdong really shaped families in this region in really distinct ways. And part of that was to do with immigration restriction in places like Australia and Canada and the United States, because it was often very hard for men to bring wives out to live with them in Australia. Although, you know, it sort of depends on the time and the place as to how easy that was. But these kind of divided families or transnational families are really very, very common.
And you can sort of map the birth of children with the visits of the husband.
Of course. Well, it would be difficult to explain if there were children without the husband's visit.
Well, it's a kind of handy shorthand for birth certificates.
Yeah. Well, we're getting close to the end, but is there anything that you'd like to kind of say to wrap up?
I guess I'd just like to say that, you know, I've found it an immense privilege and joy to be able to run these tours. As Sophie said, we learnt so much by both organising them and by going on them with the fantastic people who came on our tours with us. I think that travelling with people who are interested in history together is such a joy. And for me as a historian and as a teacher, seeing that the growing understanding of the history and the place and the culture really is that was absolutely its own reward for me.
Yeah, I think kind of, yes, I would echo all those statements. And I think that, you know, the biggest drive for Kate and I in doing these tours is that we personally just enjoyed doing them so much. We enjoyed meeting the people who came on the tours. As you can see, you know, people have come along to this talk and are having a little mini reunion in the chat. And that sort of seeing the more complex understanding that people then bring back to their family history research. I can't think of the quotes, but people talking about how a great grandfather was suddenly a person, and it really helps to. They still didn't know anything more about that great grandfather, but suddenly they became someone who wasn't a cliche. They weren't the old Chinese market gardener or some Chinese man with a shoulder pole on his shoulders. There was, I think, perhaps more possibilities of who he could be, but in providing those more possibilities, he became a real. He could be a real person rather than just a stereotype.
Oh, thank you. And I think that is amazing. So I've just had Kira ask when the next tour will be, but of course let's just not even think about that.
That's an impossible question to answer.
It's an impossible one to answer, unfortunately. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it really is. So
there's a few things in the way.
Just a few, yeah. I think a pandemic and global conflict, but just before, so to wrap up, I want to thank you both very much for your contributions and for that amazing little walk into another kind of world and universe of sort of shared Australian and Chinese history. So the photos are really amazing. So thank you. I really appreciate that. Our next session will be on the 25th of May, Wednesday at 6 p.m. And we'll be inviting Alistair Thompson and Jill Barnard, who are part of an Australian Research Council funded project based at Monash University, which is researching and writing the Australian history of fatherhood and fathering across the last century. The talk will be Australian Fathering and Family History, 1919 to 2019, learning from oral histories, and you'll be able to register for that, same as this one, and it'll be a really, really fascinating discussion. And Al will be the first man that we have had at our family history webinar, so it will be quite a pioneering thing. So thank you so much, Kate and Sophie. I really, really appreciate the effort that you put in tonight, and thanks to all of our guests for being here, and for all of the people who are reminiscing and connecting, and the other people who are just desperately hoping that they get to go on a similar tour at some stage in the future. So I really appreciate it. So with that, I might bid you all good night. Thanks,
Naomi. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Naomi.